This story is about homesteaders on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle. It's about a time when a boy named Otis was just a baby. His mother, Ruth, took him out to visit her brother and sister-in-law, Jim and Matilda. Ruth drove out in a wagon to Jim and Matilda's place west of town. It was in late springtime. Wildflowers were all around and the birds were singing. Jim and Matilda hadn't lived on their place long. They had a small barn and stable and a storm cellar and a one-room house with a porch. They hadn't been there long enough to build a larger house. Even if there wasn't much room, visitors were welcome. It got lonely out there in all of that open space. So Jim and Matilda were happy to see other folks, especially Ruth and her little baby. The women took Otis the next morning to gather agarita berries. There were many agarita bushes in the canyon not far away. The red agarita berries are sweet and tart, much like small wild plums. They make delicious preserves and pies. The agarita bush has sharp, prickly leaves so that it hurts to pick the berries by hand. The berries are harvested by spreading a cloth on the ground below the bush. The branches above the cloth are then whacked with a stick, and the ripe berries fall off onto the cloth. The cloth is then gathered up and the berries are poured out of it into a basket or a bucket. They had a picnic lunch for dinner on the ground. After lunch they waded and splashed in the creek. Otis loved it. It was late afternoon when they returned. They began to prepare the berries for making preserves. They washed the berries before starting to cook them. Near dark, Jim came in from the field where he had been working. He said it looked like a storm was making in the west. Matilda said they could use some rain and that supper would be ready in a little while. Jim went to the barn to take care of the mule team. Ruth and Matilda worked on getting supper ready. Otis was crawling around on the floor. The sun was setting behind the storm with lightning flashing and thunder booming. Wind gusted around the yard and large raindrops began to plop down. Matilda and Ruth went back to finish cooking supper. Supper had just been put on the table when they heard Jim yelling. He came splashing through the rain onto the porch and yelled, "Get to the cellar! Get to the cellar! There's a twister coming!" Jim jumped off the porch and ran to open the door of the storm cellar. Matilda screamed for Ruth to hurry, and she ran out. The air began to roar. Otis had crawled under the bed, and Ruth had to reach under to pull him out. Then came ripping and tearing and a great wrecking crash. The house had been destroyed by a tornado while Ruth and her baby were still in it. She found herself pinned down by wreckage. Rain was falling and it was pitch black, lit only by brilliant flashes of lightning. After a bit, Ruth saw a light where Jim and Matilda were coming out of the cellar with a lantern. She called to them, and they hurried to her. They got her out from under the debris. "Oh, where's my baby? Where's Otis?" cried Ruth, looking wildly around. She frantically began to move pieces of wreckage to look under them. Jim said, "Hush, Ruth, listen." All three people stood very still and listened as hard as they could. Through the sound of the falling rain, they heard a baby crying. They started out into the dark in the direction of the crying. It was coming from out in the field, northeast of where the house had been. Ruth ran ahead of the others. The sound got nearer, and Ruth ran faster. It was Otis, lying on the ground, crying for all he was worth. She picked him up, and he was covered with wet goop. "Oh, no!" she screamed. "He's cut all over, and he's bleeding to death." She hugged him to her body and wailed as loudly as he was. Jim came running up with the lantern and looked at them. "Ruth, Ruth, calm down," he said. "Calm down. Otis is covered with mud, not blood. He's all right." By the light of the lantern, Ruth examined her baby. She saw that Jim was right. Otis wasn't hurt. They trudged through the mud and the still falling rain back to the barn, which had not been touched by the twister. Jim said, "Well, we can always build another house. The important thing is that none of us was hurt." And that was the most important thing, wasn't it?